Imagine a large wooden house stretched long like an overturned ship's hull. It sits among gentle hills covered in turf, as if it grew from the land itself. In the evening, its walls begin to breathe, not with drafts, no, but with the breath of dozens of people, animals, fire, and sleep. This house is no castle, no hut. It is long, really long, nearly 30 paces from the door to the back wall. Logs stacked tightly together, dark with soot and time. The roof is covered in living sod, tufted with grass and moss like the back of an old giant. From outside, it looks asleep. Inside, it lives. Step closer and you hear the fire crackling. Just one hearth in the center, but it is the heart of the house. Smoke rises lazily from it like a yawn and curls beneath the ceiling. There's a hole in the roof, but it's almost closed. It's cold outside. The smoke doesn't hurry to leave. It spreads slowly under the beams like a cloud. It stings the eyes, but no one complains. The fire is alive. That means the night will be warm. The floor is packed earth, but along the walls it's softened with straw and animal skins. Someone laid an old fleece at the doorway to keep feet warm. People walk softly here. Every step is quiet, as if they don't want to wake the house itself. The walls remember everything: voices, whispers, coughing, laughter, even the scratch of someone's back. Simple things hang from the beams: bags of dried fish, wooden bowls, bits of rope, scraps of cloth, carved figures. This place is everything: home, pantry, workshop, bed, all together, all in one breath. Benches line the walls, covered with woolen cloth and furs. Beneath them, chests. What's inside? A knife, a keepsake, a lump of salt. Maybe just a torn mitten, but if it was grandma's, it stays. And there are sounds here, not loud: the shuffle of straw underfoot, the creak of wood, sometimes the squawk of a chicken if startled, or a dog's short bark, but mostly breathing. Warm, steady, gentle, the breath of life. This longhouse isn't just shelter. It's like skin, a second body. It protects and warms, but in return, it asks for quiet, respect, patience, because the night is long. And the longhouse, it's all that stands between you and whatever waits beyond the door. There are no rooms inside, just rows of benches, beams, and shared air. If someone stirs, everyone hears. If someone laughs, everyone warms. Even the cat perched on the rafter knows her time. She'll descend near midnight and curl between two bodies, finding the warmest spot. Windows? No, just small slits, and even those are covered. The cold would seep in otherwise. Besides, why look out? Everything that matters is inside. The longhouse holds not just warmth, but dreams, fears, and lullabies. It's like a cup filled with people. Tip it, and they'd spill. It smells of straw, sweat, smoke, damp wool, and soup. Your body gets used to it fast. The scent becomes background, a lullaby of the nose. Even the walls smell of settled years, winters upon winters, and soot you couldn't scrub off even if you tried. Along the central aisle, people move, softly, in socks, in wrappings, however they prefer. They carry water to children, adjust furs, nod silently to each other, not with words, but with eyes. No one yells here. Shouting is for outside, for danger, for the wind. In here, there is only breath. The longhouse lives by its own time, not measured by clocks, but by sound. Fire crackling, someone added wood. A sneeze, someone's caught cold. A cough, the old man's about to tell a story. The sound of a kettle lid, supper soon. Everything flows, unhurried, everything in rhythm. Children still play in the corner under a blanket canopy. That's their ship. One holds a spoon like an oar. Another pretends to summon thunder. No one stops them. If they're playing, they're not crying. And if they're not crying, the night is going well. The elders are quiet now. One stares into the embers. Another mends clothes. One just listens to the groaning roof. Sometimes it feels like the house tells stories too. Not with words, but with creaks, sighs, and flickers. It is older than anyone inside, and so it speaks less than them all. No one sleeps alone. Even the grumpy grandfather lies beside someone, even if it's a dog. Solitude is a luxury for those who are safe. In the Longhouse, you survive, and that means closer, warmer, quieter. So the first evening passes, without event, without voices, just the shifting of firelight, the whisper of hides, and the sense that someone, somewhere, is holding this whole house in an embrace. In the Viking Longhouse, people did not sleep in rooms. They slept in rows, on benches along the walls, or on the packed earth floor. They slept beside each other, wrapped in furs and wool, side by side like logs in a winter stack. Fathers beside sons, grandmothers with granddaughters. Sometimes a hound curled tightly between them, its body a furnace of breath and twitching paws. The night was not one blanket, but many layers, of warmth, of sound, of scent, of presence. You didn't lie in solitude. You folded into the warmth of others. The soft rise and fall of a neighbor's chest became your lullaby. A child's hiccup, the shuffle of someone pulling a skin closer, the soft whisper of a wife's hand over her husband's brow. These were the lullabies. Beds were not really beds. They were places. A spot in the straw, a patch of fleece that had held your shape the night before. The lucky ones had woolen padding. Others had only grass, dried and flattened. Yet no one complained. Comfort wasn't measured in inches of softness, but in the nearness of the fire and the nearness of others. And it was dark, utterly, entirely dark, save for the embers, which glowed like the breath of something ancient. Light was not needed. In darkness, you knew the contours of home by touch, by sound, by memory. You knew whose shoulder pressed into yours, whose breath tickled your cheek. You knew where the sleeping baby was, and where not to place a foot. Sometimes someone would shift, creaking a board, sighing as they turned. A dog would snort. A child might cry in a dream. But it all belonged. These sounds didn't break the night. They stitched it together. They wore what they could: thick tunics, layered cloaks, woolen socks, mittens. Even sleeping, you didn't fully undress. The cold crept in through cracks and joints and beams. So you covered your ears with a hood, wrapped your legs around another's knees, and tucked your hands beneath your belly. Everyone had their method. Some pressed warm stones into the straw beneath them. Others slept atop sheep hides, so thick it was like lying on a breathing cloud. A few whispered charms before closing their eyes, brushing fingers over small carved gods placed near their heads, just in case, just to be safe. No one slept facing the door. That was bad luck, or so they said. And no one ever would point their feet toward the fire. That was for the dead. The living curled toward it, tucked themselves in, and vanished into the shadows. The smells of sleep were rich: wool, ash, skin, and smoke. Someone's braid still held the scent of pine resin, another's hands the fat of dinner. It all mingled, and the longer you lay there, the less you noticed, until it wasn't smell anymore, just the air you breathed. And when you breathed, it showed, pale fog from your lips, mixing with the breaths of others. In winter, you could see it, a room filled with ghost clouds dancing just above the faces of the sleeping, as if their dreams were exhaling. There were no alarms, no clocks. The house woke with the fire, or with the chickens, or with a sneeze. But at night, the rhythm was slow. No sudden movements, no loud noises, just a long, unrolling hush. The eldest snored, deep and slow, like the creak of a docked ship. The youngest twitched in dreams, murmuring soft nonsense. Somewhere, someone always whispered to the gods, a little thanks, a little fear, a wish for morning. Some dreamed of raids, others of fields, or of fish too large to catch. One might dream of summer, of long boats and blue skies. Another of the time her child first smiled. Dreams didn't follow rules, but in the Longhouse they hovered together, layered on the same beams, thick as steam. And when someone awoke in the night, for water or warmth or worry, they didn't make a fuss. They moved quietly, as if sleep still held them. A ladle into the bucket, a hand over a sleeping brow, a log placed gently on the fire, then back again, beneath the skins, into the breathing pile of family. Because sleep wasn't just an act, it was trust. To close your eyes beside others, to let your mind drift while others listened, while others watched the wind outside, that was a kind of love. Not spoken, not sung, just lived. And when the cold pressed hard against the walls and the wind cried at the shutters, the Longhouse answered not with fear, but with breath, soft, steady, shared. A rhythm of life that pulsed through darkness like a slow drumbeat. No one said goodnight. There were no goodbyes. Just a glance, a tug of a blanket, a shifting of weight, and then the stillness returned. And the Longhouse, wrapped in snow and straw and skins and silence, held them all, safe, sleeping, and softly breathing. Barley porridge thickened slowly over the fire, its scent curling into the rafters, smoke-laced, earthy, familiar. Evening has settled in. The light is low, and everything moves slower now. Supper isn't a feast, it's a moment. A bowl passed from hand to hand. A spoon worn smooth by time, carved by someone's cousin long ago. The warmth isn't in abundance, but it's enough. It's in the sharing. In the Viking Longhouse, food at night was simple, heavy, and meant to last until dawn. There were no lavish dishes, no silver, no servings piled high, just porridge. Barley or oats, simmered with water, stirred until thick. Sometimes, if luck had smiled, sweetened with honey, or enriched with a sliver of dried fish or bone broth from earlier in the day. The bowls were wooden, the spoons too. Everything bore the signs of use, soft edges, stains, nicks from hungry bites. But that was the charm. A spoon worn smooth by many mouths carried the stories of all who had eaten from it. Stories were tasted, not told. One pot, one fire, one meal. The pot hung over the hearth, blackened by smoke and time. It hissed and bubbled as steam lifted through the dim air and wrapped around the rafters like a second ceiling. Sometimes herbs were added, not for flavor, but for hope. Nettles in spring, wild onion in late summer, dried yarrow in winter. Each bite carried the memory of a season. Children ate first, not because they were most important, but because they were the loudest. Small hands clutched warm bowls, blowing steam with puffed cheeks. No one used napkins. Wiping was done on sleeves or a piece of wool nearby, or not at all. Cleanliness bowed to necessity. And then the rest. Men returning from work, women finished with weaving, elders who moved slower but still had sharp eyes. Everyone took their turn. No rush. Eating was part of evening, and evening had its rhythm. Bread was rare at night. The hearth was for warmth, not baking. But sometimes a flat cake, made from leftover dough and cooked on a hot stone, would be shared between 2 or 3. Dry, rough, but familiar. The kind of taste that lived in the back teeth. If there was meat, it was stretched. A sliver of salted fish, a shred of boiled bone, a bit of sausage saved from a feast day. It wasn't about flavor. It was about weight, about filling the stomach with something that might last until morning. And once in a while, joy. A smear of butter, a lick of honey from a small pot that was hidden, saved, guarded like treasure. Children would dip a finger when no one looked, and the mother? She saw. She always saw, but she said nothing. The fire was the table. People sat in circles, cross-legged or kneeling, bowls in laps. No chairs, no formality. You leaned where you could, against a wall, a brother, a dog. You ate while someone spoke, while someone sang, while someone just stared at the fire and thought of nothing. There was talking, soft, warm, meandering. A story from the shore, a joke about someone falling in the stream, a memory about that one night when the porridge burned so badly it turned black, and everyone said it tasted better. Laughter like a yawn, slow, quiet, shared. No one left scraps. What wasn't eaten went to the dogs, or to the hens if there was a bit of grain. Waste was a foreign word. Even the burned crest at the bottom of the pot was scraped out and eaten, not because it was good, but because it was food. And food was everything. Supper ended without announcement. Bowls emptied. Spoons dropped into a shared bucket. Someone stirred the fire. Someone else folded the cloth that covered the dry oats. The night rolled forward, and the hunger softened. For those with aching teeth, there was broth. A cup of something hot, salted and thin, but better than nothing. For babies, mashed grain and water. For the old, whatever they could swallow. No one was left out. Even if you couldn't chew, you could still taste warmth. The smell of supper lingered in the Longhouse long after the bowls were stacked. Smoke clung to hair. Sweet grains curled around the rafters. A hint of ash and meat stayed in the air like a lullaby for the tongue. It became part of the house, the breath of evening, the scent of survival. Some tucked away crusts for the morning, a piece of bread in a cloth, hidden beneath a pillow. A bit of porridge left in a small dish for the spirits, or maybe for the dog if it found it first. Little gestures of continuity. You never knew what the night would bring. Eating wasn't a show. It wasn't a celebration. It was a quiet agreement. We are here, we are warm, we will try again tomorrow. And in the shadows of the Longhouse, with bellies half full and heads heavy with smoke, that was more than enough. The air inside the Longhouse turns warm not from fire alone, but from the breath of bodies, the weight of fur, the closeness of skin. In the world of Vikings, warmth wasn't something you lit, it was something you built together. A quiet gathering of heat shared between people, animals, and time. The hearth in the center helped, of course, a glowing heart fed with dry branches, bits of peat or dung shaped into bricks. The fire was constant, or nearly so. If it died, someone would wake to feed it, even if only with a whisper of kindling. But the fire was only one part. Real warmth came from closeness, from people packed side by side, layer upon layer, not just of blankets, but of beings. Children curled between parents, dogs tucked into knees. A goat might sleep beside a child. No one minded. The heat spread slowly, like a secret. It rose from the fire, yes, but it also came from socks still warm after walking, from a shawl wrapped twice around two shoulders, from feet that found other feet in the dark. There were no radiators, only skin and fur and care. They used what they had. Animal pelts, thick and musky, sometimes stiff with age, but loyal. Wolf skins, deer hides, sheep fleeces. Some lined the walls to stop the wind. Others were spread across straw to keep the cold from below. Still more were worn as cloaks, then kept on through sleep. Wool was everywhere, not soft and dyed and neat, but coarse, scratchy, uneven. It itched sometimes, but it held heat like a jar holds honey. A woven tunic over a woolen shift, then a felted cloak, then a fur. Layer upon layer until the cold gave up. And then there were stones, flat ones, heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, slipped under bedding. Not for show, for feet, for backs, for hands too stiff from the wind. Some families had only one stone to share. It was passed, night to night, like a promise. There was also steam, not in tubs, but from soup, from breath, from sweat. The air inside the longhouse was thick, damp at times. But that dampness held heat, and so it was kept in. Holes in the roof were covered with boards. Cracks were stuffed with moss. Doors were shut tight with heavy skins. People learned to live inside warmth. Not perfect warmth, but held warmth. They moved slowly to keep heat close. They spoke near the fire, letting their words touch the flames. They ate sitting low, so the heat wouldn't rise away. They curled small, conserving every inch of comfort. And yet, the cold still came. Through floor, through bone, through breath. When it bit hardest, people moved closer. No shame in that. Even the proudest warrior knew. Frost doesn't care for honor. Better to press back to back with your enemy than to die with dignity. Some wore charms against cold. A tooth of a bear, a scrap of red thread. Not magical perhaps, but comforting. And comfort, in the dark of winter, was as good as a second fire. The sounds of warmth were everywhere. The low crackle of the hearth. The soft huff of a dog exhaling through its nose. The rustle of wool as someone shifted under layers. The sleepy grunt of a goat stretching in its sleep. These were not noises. These were lullabies of survival. Even the walls helped. Thick logs, seasoned with smoke, wrapped in turf. In winter, the outer skin of the house froze, but inside, the logs breathed slowly, exhaling their stored sun. The turf above, meant for summer greening, now held in the heat like a mother's arm. The clever ones built small walls of woven sticks daubed in mud to block the worst drafts. Others stacked firewood high along the north side, not just to store it, but to create a buffer. Every little choice mattered. Warmth wasn't luck, it was skill. It was tradition passed down by hands and backs and frost-bitten fingers. Children learned early how to find warmth, not just by sitting near the fire, but by sitting near the right people. The warmest spots were earned, beside the grandmother who always wore 3 cloaks, or near the dog who never moved in sleep. They played a game of shuffling, wriggling, claiming space like cats. Warmth meant more than comfort, it meant health. A night too cold brought coughs. A week too cold brought fevers. So everyone watched. A mother would pull a blanket tighter over her child, even in her sleep. A father would lift a sleeping body closer to the embers without waking them. Warmth was love in action. And in that warmth, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes not from silence, but from safety. The knowledge that yes, it is cold outside. Yes, the wind howls, but in here, beneath this roof, wrapped in layers of breath and cloth and wool and hope, we are not alone. You didn't need to see the fire to feel it. It pulsed through the bones of the longhouse. It hummed in the straw. It curled around toes. It tickled the tip of the nose. It was not always enough, but most nights, it was. A tail thumps near the fire. Hooves shift in the straw. Soft feathers ruffle somewhere overhead. In the Viking longhouse, animals weren't just tolerated, they were part of the family. Not pets, not decorations, not distant creatures penned away for neatness. They were warmth, alarm, food, labor, and companionship. Dogs slept close to feet, often burrowed under blankets like children. They guarded the door during the day and dreams at night. Some were small, curled into the crooks of knees. Others were larger, leaning their weight into the legs of sleeping humans. Their breath, their presence, it steadied the room. The hens had their perch, high up on the crossbeam. They clucked and shifted in the dark, occasionally raining down a feather or a sleepy mutter. Sometimes one would fall off with a thump and land on someone's chest. A brief surprise, but no one startled for long. Goats huddled near the walls, chewing slowly, warming the air with their thick bodies and constant low sounds. They were not cuddly, but they were constant. A child might lean on one, absent-mindedly pressing a cold hand into the warmth of its side. It wouldn't move. Cats, where there were cats, were different. Independent, secretive, but valued. They prowled at night, soft-pawed across beams and bedding, hunting mice no one ever saw. They were keepers of silence, their yellow eyes glowing just beyond the firelight. Sometimes they curled on top of a blanket without asking. That was the rule. A cat goes where it wants, and you're lucky it chooses you. Even cows, when storms blew hard enough, might be led just inside the entrance. Their bulk brought more than milk, they brought heat and safety. The deeper the cold, the closer the cows came. They filled the space with their breath, their steady shifting weight, their quiet presence. No one spoke of animals as belonging. They weren't owned, they were known. You knew which goat didn't like being touched on the left side, which hen always pecked at red yarn, which dog only growled when something was truly wrong. These weren't facts, they were relationships. In the middle of the night, if a dog growled low, not barked, just growled, people listened, eyes opened, hands gripped knives. Silence fell heavy. The dog knew things. It heard snow shifting wrong. It smelled a stranger, or a bear, or a spirit. You didn't question it. Some animals were named, not with human names, but with sounds. Blackfoot, Red Ear, Lazy One. Names born of need, of affection, of time. A goat called Bell because it once got tangled in one. A dog called Frost because it never minded sleeping outside. These names weren't given, they happened. At mealtimes, the animals gathered too. Dogs waited at the edges, eyes wide, tails wagging with hope. A chicken might peck near someone's boot, hoping for a crumb. Goats nibbled at wool if no one was watching. And sometimes someone would share. Not because of rules, because it felt right. Children learned to feed the animals before themselves, to brush the horse, to scatter grain. These chores weren't burdens, they were beginnings. The animals needed you, and you needed them. In winter, especially, that bond kept both alive. There was affection, though no one spoke of it aloud. A hand resting on a shaggy head. A kiss pressed quickly between goat horns. A whispered good night to the hens before dark. These were moments no one noticed, but they were always there. Death came too. A dog that didn't return. A goat that went still in the night. Grief was quiet but deep. Sometimes, for days, a child would sleep curled tighter, as if trying to make up the missing shape. No one said much, but they'd lay out a bit of extra porridge the next night, just in case. Even the mess of animals was familiar. The smell, the hair, the sound of hooves scraping wood. None of it was considered unpleasant. It meant life. A silent longhouse was worse than a noisy one. Movement was warmth. Sound was reassurance. In summer, the animals often slept outside, but in winter they returned. They came like the snow, gradual and expected, and the house welcomed them, not as guests, but as those who belonged. The longhouse was never truly still. A paw twitched, a beak clicked, a goat snored, and in that subtle noise there was something sacred, a shared heartbeat across species, a shared promise, we'll survive this night, together. A thump on the wall, a hiss of wind through a crack, a sound too light to name, but heavy enough to wake someone or keep them awake. In the Viking longhouse, fear did not shout, it whispered, and everyone heard it. The longhouse was protection, yes, but it was not invincible. It creaked, it moaned, it sang the songs of wood shifting against cold and time. Sometimes it sounded like breath. Sometimes it sounded like someone just outside the door. People did not speak of monsters often, not because they didn't believe, but because they did. The dark was not empty. The forests were not still. And the night was always listening. Children were told not to whistle after dusk, not to stare too long at the fire, not to sleep with their feet uncovered. These were not rules. They were survival stories, folded into lullabies, and repeated so many times they became part of the walls. The fire was the safest spot. Its crackle was a shield. As long as the embers glowed, the shadows stayed back. But sometimes the fire dimmed, and in that dimness, thoughts crept in. What if the storm brought wolves? What if the howl was not a wolf at all? Sometimes someone would cough and no one responded, and that silence, for just a moment, felt wrong, like a gap had opened, like something had entered. And so someone would speak, just to close it. A story, a joke, a memory, anything to keep the silence from stretching too far. The rafters above held more than beams. They held stories. A man once swore he saw eyes there, green, unblinking, watching from the dark. He never spoke of it again. But for a week, no one slept directly under that beam, just in case. Every noise had a possible reason, a reason people clung to. That thump? A goat shifting. That moan? The wind. That crackle? The fire settling. But the truth was, sometimes no one knew. And not knowing, that was the scariest sound of all. Outside the Longhouse, the world was alive. Foxes screamed like children. Owls fell silent just before they struck. Snow moved in ways that mimicked footsteps. And the wind said things. It had a voice, a low one, with stories of its own. Old women knew what dreams meant. If you dreamed of a tooth falling out, someone would get sick. If you dreamed of water, there would be a visitor. If you dreamed of blood, keep quiet. Don't speak it aloud. Don't give it power. The youngest children sometimes cried in their sleep, soft half sobs, as if their dreams had grown too big for them. Their mothers would hush them, brush hair from their faces, whisper things like, "The goats are watching the door," or "The cat will chase the bad ones away." Not because it was true, but because it helped. There were charms above the doorway, bones, feathers, twisted bits of iron. They looked like decorations. They weren't. Each one placed with purpose, with a whisper, with a touch. They didn't glow, they didn't hum, but they stood between the family and everything outside. If something moved near the wall, no one leapt up. Instead, they listened to the pattern. Was it heavy? Was it fast? Was it dragging? Not everything needed reacting, but everything needed hearing. Sometimes someone would wake and sit up, heart pounding, eyes wide. But nothing had changed. The same shadows, the same breathing, the same warmth. But something inside said, "Look." And so they looked. And sometimes they saw nothing, and sometimes they saw something they never spoke of again. But not all fear was bad. Some fear was useful. It kept the fire fed. It kept people close. It kept stories alive. Because no one forgot the night when the latch on the door shifted, but no one had moved. Some nights, someone would pray louder than usual, a chant low and steady. Not to wake anyone, but to remind the dark that someone was still listening. Other nights, people would hum as they fell asleep, the kind of tune that clung to you, that told you you were still here. And if the fear grew too big, if the wind howled too loud, or the animals shifted too much, then the family would move closer together, one large bundle of limbs and breath, because whatever waited outside could not take what was held so tightly inside. By morning, the fear always faded. It slid back into the floorboards, into the beams, into the corners where no one swept. The same way frost melts, the same way shadows forget their shape. And in the soft light of a gray dawn, someone would laugh at the noise that had kept them tense. A mouse, most likely, or a loose board, or a dream. Yes, a dream. That made more sense. But even as they laughed, no one slept under that beam again. The gods did not sleep. That was both comfort and warning. In the Viking world, belief was not separate from daily life. It was woven into every breath, every silence, every shadow. There were gods for storms and gods for sowing, spirits in trees and whispers in bones. The Longhouse was not only home to people, it made space for what could not be seen. Above the main beam, a small figure carved from wood stared down. Odin, maybe, or Thor, or a nameless protector passed from hand to hand. Someone had placed dried herbs around it. Someone else had tied red thread around its base. These were offerings. Not grand, but sincere. You asked for safety the same way you asked for bread, because you needed it. Belief wasn't always loud. It didn't need temples or trumpets. It needed breath. A whisper before bed. A hand touching wood before stepping outside. A murmur over a wound. There was power in quiet things. A finger traced over a rune. A circle drawn in ashes. A name never spoken after dusk. At night, the Longhouse was a place of invisible company. Not just ancestors, though they were there, in memory, in the creak of a bench they once sat on, in the shape of someone's brow. But others too. The old gods, the land spirits, the watchers. You didn't always name them, you just left space for them. No one sat with their back to the door. That was for fools. The door was where the outside came in, and belief said it was best not to turn your back on the in-between. Children learned early. They were told not to call the wind by name, not to speak of death near the food, not to laugh too loud during snowstorms. These were not rules. These were rituals, the fabric of belief, made of wool, ash, and silence. Sometimes, someone would leave a crust of bread near the doorway. Not waste, a gesture. For a traveler, maybe? Or a spirit? Or something else entirely? No one said for sure, but the bread was always gone by morning. That was enough. The hearth was sacred. Fire wasn't just for cooking, it was for connection. Flames spoke. They rose when truth was told. They dimmed when danger was near. A woman would watch the way the smoke curled and know what kind of day was coming. This was not superstition. This was experience turned sacred. Ravens were never chased away. They were messengers. You greeted them, nodded even, offered scraps. If one followed you, you turned around and took a different path, not out of fear, out of respect, because the world was wider than it seemed. Every household had its own blend of belief. Some hung herbs for luck. Some painted runes on doorposts. Some whispered to the moon. There was no one way, just many threads in the same cloth. The sick were given more than medicine. They were given charms, bits of bone, carved wood, threads knotted by a mother's hand. These weren't cures, they were comfort. They were belief made solid, and sometimes that helped more than anything boiled in a pot. Dreams were messages. Not every night, but sometimes. If someone woke shaking, it was not ignored. A dream of drowning? Stay close to home. A dream of teeth? Light more fire. A dream with no sound at all? That one was rare. That one meant listen, but don't speak. The dead were not far. Not scary either. Just near. Just listening. A whisper during supper. She would have liked this honey. A glance toward the corner where a grandfather once carved his spoons. The dead weren't gone. They were just quiet. And in quiet, belief lived best. Loud belief was for stories. Real belief was what happened when your hand brushed the wall at night, just to make sure it was still there. When you kissed a pendant before sleep. When you lit the fire from the left side because the right had failed once, years ago. Children made up gods of their own. A mud god that lived under the straw. A tickle god that took your sock. A goat that could talk if you asked at just the right moment. Adults smiled, but never corrected them, because who could say they were wrong? Even curses had weight. If someone wished you ill, you burned the word in fire, or spat into the wind, or tied a knot 3 times in silence. You didn't laugh off a curse. You met it with belief stronger than its bite. The Longhouse itself was a kind of prayer. Its beams cut and fitted, its roof layered and packed, its hearth always breathing. To live inside it was to live inside faith. Faith in wood, in warmth, in gods who may or may not have names. So when the night settled deep and the wind curled at the edges of the walls, someone would always say it. Not loud, not soft, just sure. They're watching. That means we can sleep. A low hum rises near the fire. It's not a song yet, just a thread of sound, thin and slow, like smoke. Then another voice joins, then a third. Soon it becomes something more. Not loud, not grand, but deep, like roots. In the Viking Longhouse, songs weren't for performance. They were for remembering, for soothing, for holding things that couldn't be said in daylight. A tune passed down from a mother to her daughter, from a sailor to his son. Some were lullabies, others prayers in disguise. The words didn't matter as much as the rhythm. It was the rhythm that rocked babies to sleep, that helped hands stir the pot, that stayed in your chest long after the singing stopped. Some songs were old, so old no one remembered who made them. They spoke of fjords and birds and faraway storms. Some were new, born just that day, out of laughter or grief or the pattern of rain. A woman might hum a melody she'd never sung before, and suddenly everyone knew it. Men sang while sharpening blades, women sang while weaving, children sang nonsense as they chased each other past the goats. And in the evening, when the fire settled and the Longhouse exhaled, people sang together, not to impress, but to remember they were not alone. There were songs for births and for dying, for long winters and good hunts. Some were sharp like salt, others soft like wool. And some were barely songs at all, just breath and repetition and memory. Lullabies were the gentlest of all. They didn't promise safety, only sleep. Sleep and a world where your sister's hand would still be holding yours, where the bear stayed in the forest, where the boat always returned. One of the most beloved songs began with a question. Who keeps the door when the moon is gone? The answer changed depending on the night. Sometimes it was the dog. Sometimes it was Thor. Sometimes it was your grandfather's ghost. But always someone was there. That was the point. Songs softened the walls. They made the Longhouse feel wider, deeper, kinder. Even the animals listened. A goat would pause chewing. A dog's ear would twitch. Chickens would quiet. Sound calmed everyone. And after the songs came the dreams. Dreams in the Longhouse were rarely just dreams. They carried fragments of truth, of warning, of wishes unsaid. One person dreamed of flying, and the next day a raven perched on the roof. Another dreamed of a frozen river, and the next week ice took the path. People noticed, people paid attention. Not all dreams were welcome. Some came with teeth, with shadows, with the feeling of drowning in fur or fog. You didn't shout about those dreams. You whispered them to a mother, to a fire, to a carved stone. You let them go that way, slowly, gently. Dreaming was not something done alone, not truly. Everyone dreamed beside everyone else. A room full of breath and turning bodies, each carrying their own night inside them. Sometimes 2 people would wake with the same image: a burning tree, a lost child, a hand holding light. No one knew why, no one questioned it. The old believed that dreams were the other side of songs. Songs you sang awake, dreams that sang you asleep. Both came from the same place, a place beyond the Longhouse, beyond the sky, but somehow still close. Some people slept with objects beside them: a tooth, a coin, a smooth stone. They said it helped with dreams, made them lighter, made them stay in the hands and not in the chest. And when someone had a dream too strong to carry, they would tell it to the fire, just once, quietly. The fire would crackle, and the dream would be shared, taken less heavy. Children often dreamed of animals, of flying goats, talking foxes, bears that brought honey. These dreams were never dismissed. "Tell me everything," a parent would say, especially what the goat said. Because every dream carried a seed of fear, of laughter, of tomorrow. Songs and dreams were part of the same sleep. One softened the way into the other. You sang to enter the night. You dreamed to understand it. And both helped you wake a little more whole. When morning came, no one asked, "Did you sleep?" They asked, "Did you dream?" Because sleep was rest, but dreams were stories, and stories were what people lived for. So each night, before the fire dimmed, someone would hum, someone else would echo, and without plan or cue, a song would grow from the floor, from the walls, from the breath of everyone inside. And it would carry them into the dark, into the quiet, into whatever waited behind the eyes. And the Longhouse listened and held it all. Children never sat still for long, not even in winter, not even in the cramped space of the Longhouse. They darted between legs, ducked under benches, hid behind goats. They whispered secrets through straw and played games made from whatever was at hand. A carved stick, a bit of wool, the shadow of a spoon on the wall. Their world was smaller than the adults, but far more alive. A patch of fur became a mountain, a shoe, a boat. The folds of a cloak, a hidden cave. Where adults saw chores, children saw quests. Noise followed them, not loud, not wild, but constant. The patter of feet, the creak of floorboards, the sudden hush of mischief. Even in sleep, their presence lingered. Fists curled under chins, toes poking from blankets, dreams still clinging to their lashes. They learned quickly how to stay warm, how to sit still when the wind howled, how to wrap a cloth so no heat escaped. They watched, copied, fumbled, tried again. Childhood wasn't shielded from life, it was stitched right into it. Their toys were simple: a ball of rags wrapped tight, a wooden figure carved by an older brother, a bone with a hole in it that whistled when spun. Sometimes even a sleeping dog's tail, tugged once, then twice, then not again. There was a game called Fire Watch. One child sat near the hearth with serious eyes, pretending to guard the flame. If it flickered too much, a shout. If it went quiet, panic. The others would rush in, tossing invisible logs, saving the village from frost giants. Then someone would sneeze, and they'd all dissolve into giggles. Food was an adventure. Crumbs were treasure. A bowl of porridge became a lake. A crust of bread, a shield. One boy once declared a dried bean the king and carried it for 2 weeks in a pouch made of stitched bark. They made up songs, silly ones, loud ones, ones with no end. They echoed through the Longhouse in the dim hours before sleep, woven with claps and foot stomps. Adults rolled their eyes and smiled, always smiled. Some children talked to the fire, not just stories, full conversations. Today I saw a raven. Tomorrow I will catch it. You're listening, right? The fire always answered, with a crack, a pop, a flicker that meant, yes, go on. Fear visited them too. Shadows made large by flickering flames. Creaks in the roof that sounded like claws. But they had their guards, a ragged doll, a carved stone, a whispered rhyme. Nothing gets me while I sing. Nothing touches me while I hold this. There was a belief, or maybe just a hope, that the Longhouse liked children, that it let them play louder, fall softer, sleep deeper, that it didn't mind when they painted its beams with soot or tucked feathers into its cracks, that it remembered them. Older children helped more, stirred the pot, held the yarn, watched the goats. But even in work, they played. If I spin this fast enough, it becomes magic. If I don't spill a drop, the gods will smile. Their world was layered, real and imagined, tangled like threads in a loom. Siblings were best friends, worst enemies, co-conspirators. They shared blankets, breath, bruises, stories. They fought over space, over spoons, over the better end of a pelt. But when the cold crept in, they pressed close without a word. There was no room for pride in shared sleep. Babies were passed from hand to hand. A mother stirred soup with one arm while bouncing a bundle with the other. An aunt sang as she braided hair. A cousin tickled tiny toes, then wiped a nose, then vanished under the bench again. Care was communal. No one asked. Everyone helped. When someone got hurt, a fall, a burn, a bite, there was no drama. Just a hush, a washcloth, a song hummed low. Pain was part of play. Tears came and then passed. What mattered was the lap you landed in. On rare warm nights, the children were allowed outside before bed, just for a moment, to touch the grass, to see the moon, to chase a chicken, maybe. And when they came back in, cheeks glowing, breath quick, eyes wide, the Longhouse felt bigger, richer, like the stars had followed them inside. Their dreams were loud. Talking bears, flying goats, a tree that grew bread. They told them to each other in whispers, added to them. In my dream, we sailed a boat made of wool. In mine, the snow sang. No one laughed. Everyone listened. And in the morning, they were always the first to stir, poking out from furs, eyes wide, hungry, ready, already planning the next adventure, already wondering if the fire would talk again today. The Longhouse held them gently, not like glass, but like seeds, rough, wild, full of what was coming. It let them run, it let them fall, it let them believe. And when the night came again, they slept the hardest, tucked in crooked shapes, mouths open, arms flung over each other, dreaming, always dreaming. When someone got sick in the Longhouse, the air changed. Not suddenly, not with panic, but with stillness. Like the fire paused, like the straw held its breath. Illness didn't arrive with warning, it settled slowly, like frost creeping along a window. There were no doctors, no herbs labeled in jars. Just knowledge passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from old man to young boy who watched more than he spoke. Healing was a craft, a ritual, a hope. The sick were moved closer to the fire, not because it cured, but because it comforted. They were wrapped in furs, given broth, touched often. Not to check, just to say, you are still here. A warm cloth across the brow, fingers counting breath without needing numbers. Water poured slowly. Someone always sat nearby, even when there was nothing to do, especially then. Herbs were burned, not always the right ones, but the ones remembered. Yarrow, mugwort, thyme. The smoke curled upward and was believed to lift the sickness with it. If the smoke turned bitter, it was said the illness was trying to stay. Whispers were part of the medicine. Words repeated again and again, under breath, into the folds of blankets or the edge of a wooden spoon. You'll see the spring. You're not alone. You are warm, and we are with you. Even if they didn't cure, they closed the silence. Children understood more than they said. They watched. They brought water. They sat at a distance, quiet, tracing shapes in the dust. Sometimes they made little figures from straw and left them beside the sick. Gifts, perhaps, or guardians. When a cough lingered too long, people listened differently. When someone stopped eating, the Longhouse leaned in. People noticed when the dog stayed close to one person, when the cat refused a lap. Animals knew things. That was not questioned. There was no shame in sickness, only weariness. It was part of life, like hunger or sleep. No one blamed, but everyone prepared. Broth was always ready. Furs were always shaken. A pot of boiled water sat near the fire, just in case. The sick sometimes muttered in sleep. Names, songs, nonsense. It was never mocked. The fever is climbing, someone would say. Or, that name must be strong, they're calling for it. Dreams in illness were strange and deep. They told stories only the fire understood. And sometimes there was a healer, not someone with a title, but a person whose hands knew more. They would come quietly, kneel, touch the feet, the forehead, the belly. They never promised anything, but they stayed a little longer than others. That mattered. People took turns, watching, waking, stirring the pot, holding the wrist. No one asked whose job it was everyone's. If someone was sick, the Longhouse changed shape. It made space. Sleep was thinner when illness visited. People stirred more, sat up more. The fire was fed more often. It flickered with a kind of urgency, not panic, just presence, a reminder, we are still here. Some believed the sickness listened, that you shouldn't say, she's getting better out loud, that the illness might hear and grow jealous. So people spoke carefully, she's resting, she's quieter today, she dreams well. The old were watched differently, not more carefully, more gently. If an old man turned away from food, no one pushed. They sat closer, they spoke of spring, they offered his favorite cloth, his oldest spoon. They let the fire do what it could. Children sometimes didn't understand. Sometimes they asked, will she be better tomorrow? And someone would answer, we hope so, or the fire is strong tonight, or she's in the middle of the dream. That was enough. And yes, sometimes the sickness won. When it did, the Longhouse didn't break. It sighed. It folded around the space. It fed the others. It sang, softly, old songs, the kind that rocked a soul out the door. When someone died, they were not gone right away. They stayed until the next sunrise, or the next snow, or until the cat stopped sleeping near the bed. Then they were gone. And the Longhouse shifted again, not smaller, just quieter. But many nights the sick got better, slowly, one more breath, one more spoonful, one more moment of laughter. Healing didn't arrive like thunder, it came like light through smoke, a little at a time. And when the fever broke, when the person sat up, when the Longhouse exhaled, it was not celebration, it was relief, silent, warm, deep. A bowl of broth, a blanket aired in the sun, a smile that reached the eyes. They had no potions, no charms that always worked, but they had hands, fire, furs, and each other. And most nights, that was enough. Sometimes healing came with stories, old ones, told not for distraction, but for rhythm. There was a man who grew herbs in his beard, someone would whisper. He sneezed and cured a village. The sick would smile, even if weakly, and that was part of the medicine too. Others told of gods who caught fevers, so humans wouldn't have to. Of sea spirits who sank illness like stones. Of children who sang a single note that made a cough vanish. Were they true? That didn't matter. They were believed, and that was enough to hold someone through a hard night. People used symbols. A spoon laid across the chest to catch the sickness. A strip of cloth tied to the rafters, one knot for each day of illness. When the knots were untied, the sickness was supposed to leave. And sometimes it did. The Longhouse had memory. It had held many who had burned with fever and breathed again. It had held others who didn't. It never judged. It only wrapped around each body like smoke, slow, quiet, and always there. No one in the Longhouse thought of their beliefs as strange. They simply were. Worn smooth by repetition, tied into hair, hung above the door. These were the things that made sense in a world where snow whispered and shadows shifted. There were rules, soft ones. You didn't sweep after sunset. You never left boots upside down. You knocked on wood not just once, but 3 times, and always with your left hand. No one could say why, but everyone did it. A piece of iron hidden under a pillow could stop a nightmare. A knife tucked beneath the bed could hold back the dead. Salt at the threshold kept sickness from crossing. If you forgot one night, you'd wake uneasy, as if the Longhouse itself noticed. Babies had red thread tied around their wrists, not tight, just enough, to keep envy away, they said. Visitors were never allowed to compliment a baby without spitting near their feet. Not real spit, just the motion, the sound. Otherwise, the words could attract something watching. Bread wasn't cut at night. If you had to, you turned the knife 3 times before slicing, and never, ever handed someone a blade directly. You set it down first. Let them pick it up. Words and metal mixed too easily. If a crow circled the roof, someone stepped outside and shouted a name, not their own, just any name. It confused the spirit, redirected it. Wrong house, the voice said. Try elsewhere. Some people slept with wool in their mouths, a tiny wad tucked in the cheek, to stop the soul from wandering, they claimed. A wandering soul might not find its way back by morning. Better to weigh it down, just a little. Children weren't told the reasons for most of these things. They learned by watching, by imitation. You'd see a child step backward 3 times before entering a room, or whisper to a chicken before going to bed. No one corrected them. That's how knowledge lived, sideways. Ravens were greeted. Fire was never cursed. If you dropped bread, you kissed it before throwing it into the fire. Let the gods eat, someone would murmur. Even spoiled food wasn't wasted without a word. When someone sneezed, everyone nearby touched their chest, a protective reflex. No one explained it, not even to themselves. But it felt better afterward, like closing a door. Some people tied knots in thread to trap illness, 9 knots, always 9, then burned it in the fire the next morning. Others placed a bowl of water beneath the bed to catch bad dreams. If the water was cloudy at dawn, it had worked. Pour it out, away from the house, away from the path. There were taboos around names. You didn't name a child after someone who died young. You didn't say the name of someone who vanished in the snow. You didn't whisper the name of someone who died angry. Not at night, not near mirrors, not near fire. Mirrors, in fact, were rare. Glass was expensive, but also suspicious. You didn't want something watching from the other side. A shiny pot lid turned just so could invite the wrong gaze. Cats were treated carefully. If one sat and stared at the door, someone would place bread in the threshold, just to be safe. If the cat ate it, good. If not, it stayed there till morning. Protection, offered without words. Sometimes the superstitions contradicted themselves. One person swore by ash for good luck. Another avoided it entirely. One kept pine branches near the bed. Another said pine attracted spirits. No one argued. Each had their reasons. Each believed in what had worked once. And belief didn't need explaining. It just needed repeating. A gesture done every night. A phrase said under your breath. A glance to the ceiling beam before sleep. There were coins placed in shoes, stones placed on windowsills, bread wrapped in cloth and hidden in rafters. Not forgotten, remembered in silence, because forgetting might mean losing the protection it gave. During storms, someone always walked the length of the Longhouse, touching each beam, one by one, quietly. It was a kind of counting, a kind of prayer, making sure everything and everyone was still held. Laughter had its own superstitions. You didn't laugh too hard after dark. You didn't mock someone's dream. You never laughed at the fire. Joy was sacred, but fragile. Too loud, and something might try to steal it. Even silence was guarded. If a hush fell and no one broke it, someone would hum, just a note, to remind the house that people were still awake, still alive, still watching. Some nights, everything felt off. The air was too heavy, the goats restless, the fire hard to light. That's when people doubled their rituals. They whispered to the doorframe. They touched the water bucket 3 times. They didn't ask why. They just did. The Longhouse was built of wood and turf and smoke, but it was held together by belief, little ones, repeated like stitches, nothing fancy, just enough to keep the cold out and the dark in its place. The Longhouse grew quiet, but people never went to bed empty-handed. Each person carried something with them, not just furs or blankets, but a little piece of comfort. A smooth stone, a carved bead, a strip of cloth that smelled like home. These weren't luxury, they were anchors, small things that kept a person from drifting too far into sleep. Children clutched bundles of straw tied with string. Adults held blades beneath their bedding, not out of fear, but familiarity. Some tucked bread into cloth, in case morning came late. Others wore necklaces beneath their shirts, the cords thin from fingers rubbing them in the dark. One woman slept with a twist of wool wrapped around her wrist. Her mother had worn it. So had her mother before. It wasn't fancy, just a coil of soft fiber that felt like safety. Some kept bone needles tucked in the edge of a pillow. To stitch the dreams back together, they'd say with a smile. Or a comb wrapped in thread, not for hair, but for luck, for rhythm, for the comfort of touch. Knives were common, small ones, simple, the kind used to cut apples, or thread, or silence. They lived under bedding, wrapped in cloth, unspeaking companions in the dark. A piece of iron, heavy and cold, sat near a grandmother's knees every night. No one moved it, no one asked. It had been there since her own mother's mother gave it to her. It didn't guard exactly, it grounded. Some slept with shoes near their head, not worn, just placed, facing the door. So the spirits walk past, someone explained. Others kept dried herbs under the edge of a blanket, not for scent, for memory. Lavender for calm, juniper for dreams, mugwort for whatever might come. There were tokens carved from antler, bits of glass smoothed by the sea, feathers wrapped in yarn, stones with holes in them, all tucked into bedding, all carried like whispers. No one asked why that, because everyone had something, a reason, a story, or no story at all, just the way it felt between fingers. Children made things for each other, a bit of bark tied with twine, a button carved into a heart, a circle of thread to keep away the cold dreams. Some were forgotten in the straw by morning, some were kept for years. Even animals had their tokens, a dog with a scrap of cloth near its paws, a goat with a bell that hadn't rung in months. Familiar things, things that smelled like someone. Sleep wasn't just about closing eyes, it was about closing space, between body and blanket, between person and memory, between the now and whatever waited inside dreams. Some people whispered to the thing they carried, not loud, not every night, but often enough. Keep me safe, let me wake, stay near. These weren't prayers, they were agreements. And if someone forgot their object, if the stone was left by the fire or the cloth dropped, sleep came slower. The bed felt wrong. The dreams came strange. You could feel it. And so someone would rise, even in the cold, even in the dark, to fetch it. Only then could the house settle. No one had pillows like we think of now, just bundles of cloth or folded tunics or hands under cheeks. But near the head, always, the item, the anchor, the piece that reminded them who they were, where they were, and who might be watching. Even the fire, in its final hours, cradled offerings. A log set just so, a stick from the same tree used every night. Ritual, not routine. Gesture, not habit. The fire remembered too. Some items were passed between lovers, a ring of twine, a bit of fur from the other's cloak, something that smelled like them, so the body beside you wasn't the only thing holding you. Their scent, their story, their quiet good night wrapped in cloth. People didn't talk much about these things during the day, but at night, in the rustling dark, you could hear it, the soft click of a bead, the whisper of thread, the sigh of someone finding their shape again. If someone died, their item was not buried right away. It stayed in the bed for a night, two, sometimes more, until the space knew, until the bed stopped waiting. Then it was placed in the fire, or the sea, or under stone. In that way, sleep was never just rest. It was reunion with the self, with memory, with what mattered most. And so, the Longhouse didn't just hold bodies, it held bundles, amulets, knives, bones, bread, love. Each bed a nest of meaning, each sleeper wrapped in more than warmth. Because in the dark, when the wind pressed close and the fire shrank low, it wasn't just the walls that protected you, it was what you held. Before you could see the Longhouse, you could smell it. It met you like breath, warm, thick, layered. Smoke first, always smoke. Not sharp, but deep. Wood soaked in fire and time. Then the animal smells, fur, hide, hay turned damp from bodies lying still. Beneath that, the cooking, grains, fat, salted meat, a hint of onions if you were lucky. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was home. A scent you didn't notice unless you left and came back. Then it wrapped around you like a familiar cloak, reminding you where you belonged. There were moments when you could tell what hour it was by smell alone. Morning had steam and wool and cold skin. Afternoon carried more earth, feet, ash, drying herbs. Evening brought food. And night brought it all together. Smoke thick as sleep, wool warmed by bodies, ash, damp straw, breath. The furs carried their own memory. Sheep, goat, reindeer, each had a different weight, a different scent. Some still held the tang of wind and rain. Others smelled of the people who had slept beneath them, a mix of sweat and salt, and something softer, like skin turned to story. Clothing wasn't washed often. Water was cold and soap was precious. So tunics absorbed the Longhouse, smoke, sour bread, firewood, fur. A mother might hold a child close and inhale, and instead of dirt, she would smell warmth. Hands told their own tale. Fingers that had been near the fire smelled of soot and fat. Those who spun wool carried lanolin and fiber. A boy who had fed the goats brought hay and manure in his sleeves. No one covered their scent. They carried it like names. The straw on the floor fermented in a quiet way. It wasn't rotting, just living. Mixed with spilt broth, dropped crumbs, footsteps. Sometimes someone would scatter mint or yarrow across the top layer, more for meaning than masking. But the scent held. Above, the smoke gathered thick in the rafters. It seeped into the beams, into the hides, into the hair of anyone who stayed too long near the hearth, which was everyone. You could smell the fire on yourself hours after you left, days sometimes. The cooking changed everything. When porridge thickened, it gave off the scent of grain, grassy, nutty, warm. When meat sizzled over the hearthstone, the fat hissed a promise into the air. Even broth, plain and thin, sent up hope like steam. On special nights, someone would bake. Not often, not well, but enough to make the Longhouse shift. Flatbread against a hot stone, turning brown, crust curling at the edges. Everyone knew the smell, and even if they'd already eaten, mouths watered again. Sometimes during storms, the smell of the walls grew sharp, wet turf, mud pressed tight against wood. It reminded people of the outside, of danger, of hunger. It made them lean closer to the fire, closer to each other. Sickness had a smell too, sweat thick with fever, blankets that hadn't been moved in days. Herbs burned too fast. If you walked into that part of the Longhouse, you paused. You inhaled differently, not to judge, to brace. But healing had a scent as well. Clean water on a cloth, warm milk, the sharp green of crushed leaves, the sweetness of someone breathing easy again. Children smelled like wool and dirt and berries when they could find them, like sticky hands and half-wiped mouths and the fire they'd rolled too close to. You could track them by scent more than sight. Newborns smelled like nothing else. Milk, salt, skin and smoke, the smell of a beginning. Mothers breathed it in like prayer. Sometimes someone would sit near the wall and sew, and their hands would smell of beeswax from the thread, or resin from carved spoon. These small fragrances folded into the larger one. The Longhouse didn't smell like one thing. It smelled like 100 moments held together. Goats smelled like goats, strong, animal, real. Dogs like dust and body and wood smoke. Chickens had a dustier scent, dry, feathery. Not clean, but honest. None of it was hidden, none of it unwelcome. Visitors always noticed. "It smells like people in here," one once said. No one took offense. That was the goal. People didn't use perfume, but they used what they had: birch bark rubbed between fingers, a sprig of pine behind the ear, the crushed tip of a mint leaf beneath a wrist. Not to change the way they smelled, just to add something to it, a signature. At night, everything softened. The heat mellowed the scents. Blankets exhaled. Ash settled. Breath thickened the air. You could lie awake in the dark and smell the day behind you. Every meal, every step, every closeness. And if you woke in the middle of the night, you didn't need to open your eyes. You could smell your way back to safety. To the fire. To the fur beside you. To the Longhouse. No one survived the long winter alone. The Longhouse didn't just hold warmth, it held people, and people held each other. Not always with arms, sometimes with bread, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a glance that said, "I see you're tired. Sit." There was no schedule for care, no tally. You brought water because someone brought it to you once. You shared your fur because once someone else had shared theirs. Survival wasn't a race. It was a circle, a rhythm, a remembering. Everyone helped differently. Some stirred the pot, some kept the fire alive, some carved, mended, listened. There was the aunt who always knew when to add salt, the brother who could lift twice as much wood, the cousin who didn't say much but always found the lost sock. Care lived in gestures, in someone brushing snow from your shoulders without a word, in someone pouring broth into your bowl before filling their own, in someone pulling the blanket higher when they thought you were already asleep. There was no ceremony around this. It just was. You didn't say thank you. You showed up when it was your turn. And if you were too weak to show up, someone showed up for you. Elders passed down more than stories. They passed down ways of knowing. They could tell by how you walked whether your back ached, by how you held your spoon whether your fingers were stiff. They noticed. They remembered. They adjusted the world around you gently. Neighbors mattered too, even the ones not sleeping under your roof. If they brought fish, you took half and passed it down the line. If your firewood ran low, someone arrived with a bundle before you asked, because they'd once been cold too. Sometimes the help came from children. A little hand offering half a crust. A whispered, "Don't worry, I hid your glove." A drawing in soot on the wall to make someone smile. Help didn't have to be big, it only had to be offered. The sick were cared for without fuss. The tired were given the softest fur. Those who'd lost someone were given space, and then, gently, soup. Silence was allowed. So was laughter. So was crying, as long as it ended with someone placing a hand on yours, even briefly. In every Longhouse, there was someone who knew when to hum, who started the song when the air grew too heavy. They weren't asked, they simply did. And the sound spread, warming everyone like the fire never could. Even animals helped. A dog resting its head on your foot. A goat leaning against your side. A cat lying near the sick and not moving for hours. Their presence was a kind of medicine, steady, honest, without need for reply. And sometimes survival looked like nothing, like someone not asking questions, like someone letting you stare into the fire for as long as you needed, like someone holding the space around your silence. There were people who made things, not because they had to, but because it helped. A carved spoon when you lost yours, a new strap for your boot, A braid in your hair to make you feel seen. Small acts, deep roots. Food was shared before it was finished. You never took the last bite without checking. And if you did, you left something in return. A word, a promise, a favor for next time. Trust was everywhere. Not dramatic, just constant. You left your knife near the door. You left your child in someone's lap. You left your story in someone's ear, and none of it disappeared. You survived because someone remembered how you like your porridge, because someone woke early to start the fire, because someone sang your name into a lullaby and pretended it was for the baby. And in turn, you helped someone else survive, not with heroics, with presence, with staying awake a little longer, with putting your back between them and the wind, with giving up your dry socks because theirs were frozen. At night, the Longhouse breathed with shared effort. Each inhale not your own, each exhale given. And in that rhythm, people survived. When one person faltered, others didn't flinch. They leaned in, filled the space, carried the extra. Not forever, just until the other could carry again. That was enough. Sometimes the help came in stories. Let me tell you about the time I dropped the pot in front of the chief. Let me tell you how I once ate a beetle by mistake. Laughter softened the cold, and embarrassment, when shared, turned into glue. No one was above need. No one was beneath giving. The smallest child could bring the biggest comfort. The oldest hand could still lift the kettle. Every role changed depending on the day. You helped others not because they earned it, but because once someone helped you before you deserved it too. That was the law. Not written, not spoken, just breathed. In, out. Evening in the Longhouse didn't arrive all at once. It drifted in slowly, like mist curling through the trees. The light shifted. The edges of things softened. Voices grew low, not hushed, but rounder, like stones smoothed by water. You could feel the change. The fire grew brighter only because the world grew dim. Shadows stretched, movements slowed. People became silhouettes wrapped in wool, faces glowing orange, then fading again. Children stopped running. Their footsteps quieted, their games shortened. One by one, they were pulled into laps, onto blankets, into arms. Their energy dissolved into drowsiness, into the way they leaned without realizing. The fire snapped differently, less like a dance, more like a memory. Each spark was a thought, floating up to the smoke-darkened rafters, then gone. Someone always poked at it, not to stoke it, but to keep it company. Wool was pulled tighter, socks were rolled down and retied. Hands moved slower, wrapping bread, or stacking bowls, or braiding hair, not for necessity, but for rhythm. Small gestures that told the body, we're stopping now. The doors stayed closed. Cold crept in through the seams, but it wasn't unwelcome. It reminded people to huddle, to share. A dog curled against a leg. A cat chose a lap. Even goats grew still, their presence becoming part of the floor. Elders told short stories, not to entertain, but to hold space. When I was small, the sun refused to rise for 3 days. Once, the wind carried off our bread. People smiled, not because they believed, but because they understood the shape of comfort. Songs sometimes happened, not planned, just a hum that grew into words, then caught by another voice and another, until everyone was singing without looking at each other. Not loud, just enough to carry the warmth between them. There was always someone who whispered a prayer, sometimes aloud, sometimes just lips moving in the dark. It didn't matter which god. It mattered that the sound softened the room. The smell of evening was different. More wood than smoke, more wool than meat, more breath than labor. It lingered around shoulders, in folds of blankets, in the space between furs. If there was food left, it was shared without comment. A crust here, a sip there. Not hunger, just habit, just the kindness of offering. The walls turned darker, not because they changed, but because eyes adjusted. You could trace the shape of each beam by how it disappeared, by how it held the firelight and then let it go. The floor creaked less. People moved less. Even the animals seemed to understand the hour. A hen tucked her head beneath her wing. A piglet sighed. A baby whimpered, then quieted, rocked without rising. And always the fire. Not a roaring thing, but steady. Sometimes high, sometimes low, but always present. Like a heartbeat for the house, like breath. Sometimes someone would rise to add a log. The flame would leap in surprise, then settle. Its light would dance for a moment on the walls, showing faces, fingers, familiar things, then fade again. Whispers took over from speech. Names were said gently. Promises were made for tomorrow, simple ones. I'll fetch water. I'll mend your sleeve. I'll remember. They weren't grand. They were enough. And if someone wept, because grief doesn't follow clocks, the Longhouse didn't stir. It just held, just stayed. The fire crackled. The air thickened. Someone might place a hand nearby, not to fix, just to be there. The youngest were covered first. Blankets pulled to chins, socks checked, hair smoothed. Then the elders, a shoulder eased, a pillow adjusted, a hand held a little longer than needed. The middle ones, the ones who carried most of the day, curled into each other. Not for love, for weight, for sharing the ache of muscles and the coolness of night. Someone always told the last story. It was never long, never planned, just a voice in the quiet, telling of a fox who tricked the moon, of a crow who stole warmth, of a girl who found a coal and carried it all the way home. The story faded before it ended. That was the point. Let sleep finish the tale. You could measure evening by the sounds. A final cough, a baby's sigh, a spoon set gently in a bowl. Then silence, then fire, then breath. The rafters were dark now. The walls were gone. Only the hearth remained, and the shapes around it, rising and falling like the tide. If you listened close, you could hear the old wood settling, the stones adjusting, the wind wondering whether to knock, and the house breathing, not with fear, but with fullness. This was the evening. Not a time, a feeling. The soft fold between day and night. The space where weariness met comfort and became peace. And it happened again, and again, and again. Evening rituals didn't need names. They unfolded the way snow melts, without announcement, without plan. You just did them because you always had, because your mother had, and her mother, because the fire said so. First came the hands, always the hands, washed if possible, wiped if not, rubbed together slowly as if remembering something. Then the furs, shaken, turned, checked for insects. Not hurried, just done. One by one, each space was prepared like a nest, with care, not ownership. Next, the quieting. You spoke less, you stepped softer. You folded your own weight inward, as if becoming smaller made the darkness gentler. It wasn't fear, it was respect. There were no mirrors, but everyone adjusted something. Hair, a cuff, a pendant. Not to look better, just to feel finished. Children were taught the order of things. Lay the fur flat, turn toward the fire, say something kind, if not to someone, then to the air. There were charms to whisper. Let the night be whole. Let the dreams stay near. Let the bones rest. These weren't prayers. They were blankets made of words. Some people traced circles on their chests before lying down. Others clicked their tongues softly 3 times. It meant different things, but always the same message. I'm still here. Let me stay. The fire was not put out, just fed one last time. Enough to last until the coldest hour. No more, no less. Sometimes someone would walk the edges of the room, touching each post, noticing each breath. A silent head count without numbers. Blankets were shared before they were needed. Take mine, I'm still warm. No, keep yours, I have two. It didn't matter who won. What mattered was that someone offered. You brushed crumbs away, tucked stray hair behind ears, adjusted the sleeping goat, pulled the dog closer, all without speaking. There was always a final thing. For some, it was setting a spoon by the bed. For others, it was tying a knot in string and placing it beneath the pillow. For one woman, it was biting her thumbnail once and tapping the wall. No one asked why. The rituals held the house together more tightly than its beams. They said, "We are not in the dark alone. We've been here before. We'll be here again." Some kissed their fingers and pressed them to the roof beam. A thank you, maybe, or a promise, or both. The fire hissed occasionally. The air cooled, but it didn't bite. You rapped deeper, not in fear, but in closure. A child might whisper, "What if I forget the morning?" And someone would answer, "The morning never forgets you." Some slept on their backs, others curled. Some curled around others. There were no rules for shape, only for presence. And when someone spoke in their sleep, no one mocked. If anything, someone listened more closely, as if the dream might be important. It wasn't just people who had rituals. Animals circled 3 times before lying down. A rooster might grunt once before tucking his head. A sheep might lean, not fully asleep, but trusting. One man always tapped the ground twice before resting. He said it was for the ancestors, or for mice, or both. No one minded. Sometimes, someone would retell a small memory, just before the last breath of speech left the room. "I caught snow on my tongue today. I saw 3 crows, not 2. I dreamed of summer and couldn't smell the fish." They weren't stories. They were doors closing gently. When the last shift of fur was heard, when the last cough was done, when even the fire stopped crackling, the house breathed once, long and low. And the night was allowed in. Not as an enemy, but as an old visitor, known by its silence, welcomed by its stillness. This was sleep not as escape, but as a ceremony. And it happened every night, even when the world outside howled, even when dreams were heavy, even when the fire burned low. Because the rituals held, because the people held, because the house remembered, and because someone always whispered, "Rest now, I'm still here." Not every day in the Longhouse was quiet. Some days arrived with a knock, not on the door, but in the air. A shift, a tension, a story waiting to begin. This was one of those days. It started with the goat screaming. Not bleating, not complaining, screaming. A long, offended, wounded cry that startled even the rooster into silence. People sat up before they opened their eyes. A wooden bowl dropped, a child gasped, and then someone, always someone, muttered, "Not again." The goat, it turned out, had fallen into the ash bucket. No one knew how. The ash bucket was against the wall. The goat was tied near the door. And yet, somehow, there it was, ash-covered, outraged, perfectly fine, and determined to tell the world about it. There was laughter, of course, but muffled, because this was only the beginning. The next surprise came in the form of a stranger, not a warrior, not a traitor, just a man with one boot, a limp, and a basket of pears no one had asked for. He said he came from the fjord, that he'd followed a dream, that he had something to deliver, though he couldn't remember what. Everyone agreed not to ask questions until after supper. Meanwhile, the children played with the goat, now dusted clean and smelling like old fire. One of them braided a ribbon into its beard. The goat, having had its moment, accepted the attention like royalty. And still, the oddness didn't end. Around midday, the best pot, The big one, the one used for feasts and thick porridge, vanished. No crack, no thud, no trail. It had been sitting near the fire. Then it wasn't. People looked under beds, behind benches, under the goat. They asked the stranger, who said, "I've never seen a pot in my life," which seemed suspicious, but he smiled so kindly they let it go. Supper became a comedy. A dozen small pots arranged in a circle, all trying to do the work of the one that had disappeared. There was stew in a ladle, stew in a bowl balanced on a spoon. Someone tried using a helmet. It did not go well. Laughter returned, bigger this time. One of the elders pretended to trade his seat for a pot lid. A baby was crowned Lord of the Soup. The dog stole a turnip, and no one chased him. The goat found the missing pot just before sleep. It had somehow been nudged behind the firewood stack, where it sat, silent, soot-covered, and completely unharmed. No one asked why the goat was looking there. Some truths aren't for speaking. That night, the stranger sang. A low song, soft and broken in places, like something learned long ago and left outside in the rain. People didn't ask him to stop. They didn't ask him to stay. They just listened, each hearing something they needed. He left before dawn, took nothing, left the pears. No one saw him go. The next morning, the pot was warm before anyone touched it. The stew tasted better than it should have. The goat slept late, and no one spoke of the ash. That day became one of those stories told softly, long after. Do you remember the goat and the ash? The man with the boot and the pears? The stew in a helmet? It wasn't a day of war, or love, or death, but it stayed. Because sometimes the unusual is what helps the usual feel sacred. Because laughter, like warmth, is better when shared after a long silence. Because in the middle of hard winters and harder memories, the house still remembers the day the goat found the pot, and the stew, though thin, had never tasted so good. It was the kind of night that even the fire didn't want to stay awake for. A wind came from the north, sharp and sly, slipping through walls like it knew the way. The Longhouse creaked, not from age, but from trying to hold its breath. Everyone felt it, that shift, that hush. Not the good kind, not the sleepy kind, but the kind that made the dog whimper in his sleep and the cat vanish without a sound. The cold was different that night. Not just deep, but strange. It didn't bite. It waited. It watched. Someone said it was the ice spirits. Someone else said, "Don't give it a name. Names bring it closer." That night, no one told stories. No one sang. They only fed the fire, not because they were cold, but because they were afraid not to. Even the children knew. They curled closer, but not for dreams. They didn't cry, but their eyes stayed open longer, watching the fire, counting its breath. A goat refused to lie down. A hen wouldn't close her eyes. The animals knew something the people only guessed. The moon was gone, not hidden, gone. The sky was thick and still and wrong. Someone whispered, "It's the kind of night when things knock." And then, something did. Not loud, just once. A single knock against the outer beam. Not like a fist, like ice, like stone against bone. No one moved, not even the baby. And then, nothing. They waited, breath held, fire high, hearts loud. Nothing. So someone whispered, "Maybe it was the wood settling." Someone else whispered, "Maybe we're the ones who need settling." They laughed, quiet, forced, grateful. But sleep didn't come easy, not that night. One woman placed her shoes backward at the foot of her bed. To confuse spirits, she said. One man slept with a piece of salt in his mouth. To keep his soul grounded, he said. One child drew a door in the air, then locked it with her breath. And still the cold waited. It didn't come in, but it let them know it could. The fire fought all night. Flames rose and fell like courage in a storm. Sometimes strong, sometimes tired, but always there. A log cracked suddenly, loud like thunder. Someone cried out, then silence again. You could hear hearts that night. You could hear wishes. Let me see the sun again. I forgot what grass smells like. And the child said nothing, but clutched a doll so tight the fabric creaked. And then, somehow, the dark passed. Not fast, not kind, but it passed. The fire faded, the wind left, the animals moved again, and the sky, pale, not bright, but enough. They hadn't slept, but they had stayed. And in that staying, they found something stronger than fire. The morning didn't cheer, it didn't rush in, it crept, unsure, like it had been scared too. But it came, and the people sat up, stiff and slow, but whole. They looked at each other, not with relief, with recognition. They had shared the same night, the same fear, the same waiting. The stew was thin that morning, but no one minded. They ate it hot, with hands that still shook a little. And someone finally said, "We'll tell this one, but softly, later, when it's summer." Because some nights don't need to be remembered loudly. Because some fears don't need names, only fire and closeness and waiting. Because survival, in the end, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just staying still, together, until the sky changes. Some nights did not go as planned. A pot cracked, a child got sick, a storm arrived too early or stayed too long. Things slipped, broke, spilled. The stew burned, the dog ran off, the roof leaked. And still, the Longhouse held. One night, someone knocked the water bucket over just as the fire needed it most. A hiss, a gasp, a panic, and then silence, smoke, darkness. For a moment, they were sure the night had won, but a spark remained. So someone fanned it, someone found twigs, someone found their breath, and together they coaxed the fire back like an old friend too hurt to rise, but too loved to leave behind. The stew that night was half raw, half charred, and everyone swore it was perfect. Another time, the baby cried for 3 hours straight. No cause, no cure, just tiny fists and endless howls. People passed her from arm to arm, whispering songs they barely remembered. The dog covered his ears. The goat tried to hum. In the end, it was the old man, deaf in one ear, who rocked her without fear. He didn't sing, he just smiled, and somehow that was enough. There were nights when snow crept in like a guest who'd lost its way, through the roof, under the door, through the smallest gaps that even mice ignored. People plugged them with fur, with cloth, with hands if they had to. Just until morning, they said. It only has to hold until then. Sometimes someone fell ill. A cough that wouldn't stop. A fever that whispered nonsense. Eyes that looked past the fire into something far away. No doctors, just broth and hope and someone to sit close, to say, stay. And if they didn't stay, then the next night was quieter, but not colder. They remembered. They touched the empty place. They left a space in the stew bowl. Not every wrong was tragic. Once, the roof caved in under the weight of 3 goats and 1 daring child. No one was hurt, except the dignity of the goats. Laughter bounced off the beams like summer thunder. Once, someone accidentally seasoned the porridge with ashes, and someone else swore it tasted complex. They all ate it, twice. They didn't fear mistakes. They made room for them. The Longhouse was wide enough for accidents, missteps, and the kind of laughter that follows disaster. The rule was simple. If something went wrong, you fixed what you could, forgave what you couldn't, and passed the spoon anyway. Someone always passed the spoon. There were tools to help, of course. A scrap of cloth for wounds, a charm for stubborn luck, a game played in whispers to calm a child who feared thunder. But mostly, there were people. People who knew where the roof leaked and how to sleep dry beneath it. People who knew how to laugh when the stew was thin. People who said, "That was me last week," and meant it kindly. Because survival was not a performance, it was a participation. Not one person against the night, but all of them together. When something broke, it became a story. When something failed, it became a lesson. When someone cried, they became more loved, not less. The house held because the people did. One night, all the candles went out at once. A gust, maybe, or a spirit playing tricks. For a moment, they sat in perfect dark, eyes wide, breaths held. Then someone sneezed, and everyone laughed. The kind of laughter that rises like bread, slow, warm, inevitable. They didn't relight the candles. They just sat there, together, in the dark, letting the fire's glow do what it could. That was enough. Because the light didn't need to be perfect, only shared. Because the fire didn't need to roar, only survive. Because the people didn't need to be brave, only there. And every time something went wrong, they remembered something that had once gone right and let it carry them. They didn't fix everything. They didn't need to. They just stayed, listened, wrapped blankets tighter, stirred again, sang off-key, offered a hand, made tea from roots, waited for morning, watched for stars. And in the end, the house always held, not because it was built strong, but because it was filled with the kind of hearts that don't quit when it's hard, only grow quieter, more stubborn, more kind. And that too became a ritual. Because when everything goes wrong, and it will, you just gather closer and whisper, "We're still here." Let the night fall now. Let the fire slow, and the voices soften, and the shadows stretch long across the wooden beams. Let the Longhouse breathe, one last time, like an old chest rising with sleep. Nothing else is needed. No more stories, no more songs. Just this, the hush, the warmth, the weight of wool on skin and wood beneath your back. There are bodies close and breath shared, and the comfort of knowing someone is near, even in silence. Outside, the wind may roam, the cold may scratch, but inside, the walls remember. Every laugh, every cry, every prayer whispered into the thatch. Every moment of almost breaking, and the hands that stitched life back together again. The house was not just a shelter. It was a memory made of timber and time. Its bones held the scent of old meals, old fears, old joys. Its floor remembered footsteps that no longer passed. Its rafters echoed songs that hadn't been sung in years. The house knew, and still it stood, like them. And as the last embers blink low, as the last sigh escapes lips too tired for words, the Longhouse gives one final gift: peace. Not the loud kind, not triumph, but the soft kind. The kind you earn by enduring, by mending, by staying. It whispers to every sleeper, "You made it. You did enough. You are enough. Sleep now." The past is still here, not heavy, but close, like a hand on your shoulder, like a name you once carried, like a breath in the dark that reminds you you're not alone. And if you listen, really listen, you might hear them still. The voices of those who came before, and those not yet born, overlapping like the grain in the wood, soft and layered, steady and deep. You might hear the goat shift, the dog groan softly, the wind hum through the cracks with no threat, only memory. You might smell the faintest scent of porridge, smoke, sweat, and fur. You might feel the world pause, not stop, just pause, long enough for your shoulders to drop, long enough for your heart to say, yes, this is rest, this is safety, this is home. And when the morning comes, as it always does, nothing will be perfect. The stew will need stirring. The roof may leak. Someone will stub a toe, or forget the salt, or burn the oats. But none of it will matter, because they stayed, because you stayed, because the house held, and so did the people in it. And in every crack, and every scar, and every crooked beam, there is proof, not of perfection, but of presence, not of triumph, but of tenderness, not of ease, but of endurance. Let the Longhouse sleep now. Let the wind move on. Let the world outside wait. The fire may fade, but the warmth remains. In the walls, in the wool, in the breath that settles deep, and in the truth that, even here, even now, after everything, they are not alone, and neither are you.